A police dog wakes up a sleeping girl in the middle of the night, and when her parents discover what he saved her from, they break down in tears. This isn't just a story about a loyal pet. This is the story of how one dog's instincts prevented a tragedy that would have shattered a family forever. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the danger that was lurking just outside their home, the moment that changed everything, and the devastating truth that made these parents realize how close they came to losing their daughter to something unthinkable. Stay with us. The Morrison family had everything figured out. David and Sarah Morrison lived in the kind of neighborhood where manicured lawns stretched endlessly in perfect geometric patterns, where the biggest worry was which country club to join for the summer, and where danger felt like something that happened to other people. People on the news, not people like them. Not people who had worked hard, played by the rules, and earned their slice of the American dream. Their home was a sanctuary. A sprawling two-story colonial with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and the kind of security system that blinked green lights in the darkness like a promise of safety. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be. Emma, their 13-year-old daughter, had her own room decorated with posters of her favorite bands, her desk organized with color-coded textbooks, her life mapped out with the kind of certainty that only comes from a childhood spent in perfect comfort. The kitchen was spotless. Granite countertops gleaming under soft lighting, a refrigerator stocked with organic vegetables and grass-fed beef. The garage held 2 reliable cars, both paid off, both serviced regularly by the same mechanic they'd trusted for 15 years. Life was predictable. Life was safe. Life was perfect. But perfection, as it turns out, is fragile. It's built on the assumption that the world outside your walls is operating the way you think it is. It's built on the belief that bad things happen to other families, in other neighborhoods, in other towns. It's built on the dangerous illusion that if you do everything right, if you follow all the rules, if you build your walls high enough and your security system strong enough, then nothing will ever touch you. The Morrison family was about to learn how wrong that assumption could be. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Jake arrived. The leaves were just beginning to turn gold and crimson, and there was that particular smell in the air, the smell of summer dying and autumn being born. He wasn't a puppy bounding out of a breeder's home, all enthusiasm and innocence. He wasn't a family dog looking for a second chance after being abandoned at a shelter. Jake was a retired K-9 officer. 9 years of service with the police department, 9 years of training, 9 years of walking into situations that would terrify most people. He was trained to detect threats, trained to protect, trained to sense danger that human eyes couldn't see and human ears couldn't hear. His entire nervous system had been rewired by years of work, calibrated to pick up on the smallest signs of threat, the faintest hint of danger. His handler, Officer Martinez, had taken him in when Jake's working days were over. But Martinez's health was failing. His heart wasn't what it used to be, and the stress of the job was catching up with him. He needed someone he trusted, someone who would understand what Jake was, someone who wouldn't try to turn him into a pet, but would respect what he'd been through, what he'd seen, what he carried inside him. That someone was David Morrison. David had grown up with police officers in his family. His uncle had been on the force for 30 years. His cousin worked homicide. He understood discipline in a way that most people didn't. He understood loyalty. He understood that Jake wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier coming home from war, needing a place to rest, needing a home where his skills would be respected rather than dismissed. "He's calm," Officer Martinez said, handing over the leash on that Tuesday morning, his weathered face lined with concern and gratitude. But he never really stops working. His instincts, they're always on. "You'll see it. He notices things. He notices everything. Sometimes it'll seem like he's paranoid. But I want you to understand that paranoia kept me alive more times than I can count. That paranoia is what makes him special. Sarah wasn't entirely sure about this arrangement. She'd wanted a golden retriever, something friendly and gentle, something that fit the perfect suburban image, something that would look good in family photos and wouldn't require the kind of attention that a working dog would demand. But she saw something in David's face when he looked at Jake. A respect, a gratitude, a recognition of something she couldn't quite name. She understood that this wasn't about what she wanted. This was about giving a hero a home, about honoring the work that Jake had done, about recognizing that some beings deserve more than just shelter. They deserve sanctuary. For the first few days, Jake was quiet. He moved through the house with a measured gait, his dark eyes, the color of burnt coffee, taking in every corner, every window, every door, every potential exit and entry point. Emma tried to pet him, and he allowed it with a kind of patient tolerance, his body remaining still while her small hands ran across his fur. But he didn't seek her out. He didn't wag his tail or nuzzle against her leg the way a normal dog might. He seemed content to simply exist in this new space, adjusting to a life that didn't involve sirens and suspects and the constant pressure of being ready for anything at any moment. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle that David almost missed it. But Sarah noticed. Emma noticed. And by the end of the first week, it was impossible to ignore. It started small. A restlessness that seemed to build as the sun began to set. Jake would pace the living room at night, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that became almost hypnotic. Click, 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 back and forth, back and forth. The sound would echo through the quiet house like a clock counting down to something. Sarah noticed it first. She'd wake up at 2 a.m. to the sound of those nails, and she'd lie in the darkness listening to Jake moving through the shadows like a ghost, like a sentry on patrol, like something was hunting him through the house. "He's just adjusting," David said when she mentioned it over breakfast. "Give him time. He spent 9 years working. He needs to decompress to understand that he's safe now." But the pacing didn't stop. It intensified. It grew worse with each passing night. Within a week, Jake had developed a pattern so consistent that you could set your watch by it. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house grew dark, something shifted in him. His entire demeanor would change. His ears would perk up, rotating slightly as if tracking sounds that human ears couldn't detect. His body would stiffen, his muscles tensing beneath his dark fur. He'd move to the sliding glass door in the living room, the one that led to the backyard, the one that faced the woods beyond their property line. And he'd stand there, completely still, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. Then the whining would start. It was a low, guttural sound. Not the whine of a dog wanting to go outside for a bathroom break. Not the whine of hunger or discomfort or the simple desire for attention. This was different. This was primal. This was urgent. This was a warning, the kind of sound that made every instinct in your body scream that something was wrong. "Jake, come here," Sarah would call, and he'd obey immediately, his training overriding whatever impulse was driving him to stand at that window. But his body remained tense, coiled like a spring ready to release. His eyes would dart back to that window, back to the darkness beyond, back to whatever he could sense out there in the night. Emma noticed it too. She was the one who spent the most time with Jake. sitting with him on the back porch in the afternoons, doing her homework while he lay nearby, his body never fully relaxed, his eyes always alert. And she began to sense that Jake wasn't just being quirky or difficult. He was trying to tell them something. He was trying to communicate a message that they were too distracted, too comfortable, too safe to understand. "Dad, I think something's wrong with Jake," she said one evening at dinner, pushing her food around her plate. "I don't think he's adjusting. I think he's trying to warn us about something." "The vet said he's fine," David replied, cutting into his steak with the kind of certainty that comes from a man who believes he understands the world. "Just needs time to decompress. He spent his whole life in high alert mode. Now he needs to learn how to relax." But Jake wasn't decompressing. He was escalating. Every single night, his behavior grew more frantic, more desperate, more impossible to dismiss as simple adjustment issues. By the second week, his behavior had become impossible to ignore, even for David. Jake would stand at the windows for hours. The living room window, the kitchen window, the window in Emma's bedroom. His body trembling slightly, his eyes tracking something invisible to human eyes. He'd pace the perimeter of the house like a sentry on duty, like a soldier walking the fence line of a compound under siege. And at night, the whining would turn into something more desperate. A low, almost mournful sound that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up, that made Emma pull her blankets closer, that made David lie awake wondering if he'd made a mistake bringing this dog into their home. "There's something out there," Emma whispered to her mother one night, watching Jake stare out into the darkness, his body pressed against the glass. "I know there is. Jake knows something we don't. I can feel it. Can't you feel it?" Sarah wanted to dismiss it. She wanted to believe that this was just a dog adjusting to a new home, that Jake's police training was making him overly cautious about perfectly normal suburban sounds, raccoons in the trash, deer passing through the yard, the normal nocturnal activity of a forest neighborhood. She wanted to believe that everything was still perfect and safe, and exactly as it should be. But deep down, in that place where a mother's instincts live, in that primitive part of the brain that remembers when humans were prey, she knew her daughter was right. Something was different. Something had changed. And whatever it was, Jake could sense it. David tried to rationalize it. "Dogs have instincts we don't understand," he said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. He called the vet again. He researched canine behavior online. He read articles about police dogs transitioning to civilian life. But nothing he read explained the intensity of Jake's response, the way his entire being seemed focused on that darkness beyond their walls. Sarah started locking the doors more carefully. She found herself checking them twice before bed, then 3 times. She started closing the curtains in rooms they weren't using. She started paying attention to sounds in the night that she'd previously ignored. The creak of the fence, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of a car passing on the road beyond their property. Emma began sleeping with her door locked. She began keeping her phone on her nightstand, fully charged. She began to sense, with the strange intuition that teenagers sometimes possess, that the world was not as safe as she'd always believed it to be. And Jake continued his vigil. Night after night, he stood guard. Night after night. He tried to tell them something they couldn't quite understand. Night after night, he waited for the thing he could sense approaching. What the Morrison family didn't realize was that Jake wasn't being paranoid. His instincts, honed by 9 years of police work, trained to detect threats that human senses couldn't perceive, calibrated to recognize danger in its earliest stages, were picking up on something very real. Something that was watching their home. Something that was studying their patterns. Something that was getting closer with each passing night. The third week began like any other week in the Morrison household. David left for work at his accounting firm at 7:30 a.m., kissing Sarah goodbye at the door with the kind of perfunctory affection that comes from 15 years of marriage, comfortable, familiar, but lacking the spark of genuine connection. Emma caught the school bus at 8:15, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her mind already focused on the algebra test she had fourth period. Her teenage concerns still centered on grades and social hierarchies and the small dramas of high school life. Sarah settled into her routine. Brewing her second cup of coffee, scrolling through her emails, checking her social media accounts, the gentle hum of suburban life continuing exactly as it always had. Day after day, week after week, year after year. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Beneath that surface, however, something was building. Something was intensifying. Something was reaching a critical point that would soon become impossible to ignore. Jake's behavior had moved beyond the simple pacing and whining that had characterized the previous weeks. It had evolved into something far more disturbing, far more urgent, far more impossible to explain away with simple reassurances about adjustment periods and police dog training. This was something different. This was something that spoke to a level of threat that transcended normal canine anxiety. He had stopped eating properly. His food bowl would sit untouched on the kitchen tile, the kibble growing stale and unappetizing as he ignored it in favor of his vigil at the windows. Sarah tried everything she could think of. She added wet food to his bowl, hoping the stronger smell would entice him. She warmed his meals in the microwave, thinking that the aroma of heated food might trigger his appetite. She tried hand-feeding him, sitting on the kitchen floor with pieces of kibble in her palm, offering them to him directly. But nothing worked. He would take a few bites to be polite, to acknowledge her effort. Then he would turn away and return to his post at whichever window was calling to him most urgently. His ribs began to show more prominently beneath his dark coat, the bones becoming visible as his weight dropped week after week. His energy, which had always been controlled and measured and professional, became almost manic, frantic and desperate and impossible to contain. The pacing had evolved too, developing a pattern and purpose that suggested something far more deliberate than simple nervous behavior. It wasn't random anymore. Wasn't the aimless wandering of a bored or anxious dog. Jake had developed a specific route through the house that he followed with military precision. Living room window, kitchen window, back door, hallway, Emma's bedroom window, front door, and then back to the living room to begin the circuit again. Over and over. Every 15 minutes or so, he would complete this route, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that became almost hypnotic, almost maddening in its consistency. His breathing would become more labored with each circuit, his whining growing louder and more insistent, his desperation becoming more palpable with each passing hour. But it was the nights that had become truly unbearable. The nights were when Jake's behavior reached its most intense, most disturbing peak. Sarah had stopped sleeping. Sleep had become impossible, a luxury she could no longer afford. She would lie in bed next to David, her body physically present, but her mind entirely elsewhere. Listening to Jake's movements below, tracking his progress through the house by the sound of his nails on the hardwood. She would listen to the way he would position himself at different windows, moving from one to another as if searching for something. as if trying to determine from which direction the threat would come. She would listen to the desperate sounds he made. Sounds that seemed to contain a message, a plea, a warning that she couldn't quite decode. A language that transcended words but communicated urgency and fear and desperate need. Around 2 or 3 a.m., Jake would become particularly frantic, as if some internal alarm was sounding, as if his police training was telling him that this was the hour of greatest danger. He would pace faster, his movements becoming almost frenzied, his whining escalating from a low moan to something that bordered on a howl. Sometimes he would scratch at the sliding glass door, something he'd never done before. His nails making a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard that made Sarah's teeth ache and her skin crawl. The sound would echo through the quiet house. A sound of desperation and warning and primal fear that no amount of rationalization could explain away. Sarah would lie there in the darkness, listening to these sounds, and she would feel her own anxiety climbing higher and higher, her own fear growing more intense, her own conviction that something was genuinely, fundamentally wrong becoming more unshakable. "We need to do something," she finally said to David one morning, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep, dark circles under her eyes, so pronounced they looked like bruises. Her entire demeanor carrying an edge of desperation that couldn't be ignored. This isn't normal behavior, even for a police dog, even for a dog that spent 9 years in high-stress situations. Something is genuinely wrong. Something is happening, and Jake is trying to tell us what it is. David looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw the fear there, not the casual concern of someone dealing with a misbehaving pet, not the mild frustration of someone whose dog was causing minor problems. This was genuine, bone-deep fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing, on some instinctual level, that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, that the safety you've built around yourself is an illusion, that danger is closer than you want to admit. "I'll call the vet again," he said, his voice carrying less certainty than before. "And maybe we should call Officer Martinez. Maybe he has some insight into what's happening, some explanation that would make sense of all this." "I already called him," Sarah interrupted, her words tumbling out in a rush. 3 days ago. I called him and I told him about Jake's behavior. And he said that Jake's behavior, while intense, isn't unusual for a canine transitioning to civilian life. He said that sometimes these dogs can sense things we can't, and that we should trust Jake's instincts. He said that Jake's instincts are probably the most reliable thing in this house right now. "Trust his instincts to do what?" David asked. But he already knew the answer. He could see it in Sarah's face, could read it in the way her hands were trembling, could hear it in the strain in her voice. She was beginning to believe that Jake wasn't just being a difficult dog, wasn't just displaying the quirky behavior of a retired police dog learning to relax. She was beginning to believe that Jake was trying to warn them about something real, something concrete, something dangerous. Emma was struggling too, and her struggle was becoming impossible to hide or rationalize away. She'd always been a good student, a focused student, the kind of girl who maintained a 4.0 GPA without much effort, who seemed to have an innate understanding of how to succeed in the academic world. But her grades had started to slip. First, just a little. A B+ instead of an A on a history test, a 92 instead of a 98 on a chemistry quiz. But then, the slippage had accelerated. Her teachers had begun to note that she seemed distracted, anxious, unable to focus on lessons or engage with material that she would normally find interesting. She would stare out the window during class, her mind clearly elsewhere, her body present, but her consciousness turned inward, focused on something that no one else could see or understand. At lunch, she would sit with her friends but barely eat. Her eyes distant, her thoughts turned inward. Her usual animated conversation reduced to monosyllabic responses and forced smiles. Her friends had noticed the change too, and they were beginning to worry about her. "Are you okay?" her best friend Madison asked one afternoon, concerned by the change in her usually bubbly companion, concerned by the way Emma seemed to be withdrawing from the world. "You've been weird all week. Actually, you've been weird for like 3 weeks now. Is something wrong? Did something happen?" "I'm fine," Emma said automatically, the words coming out by rote, the standard response that teenagers give when they don't want to explain what's really going on. But it wasn't true. She wasn't fine. She was picking up on something that her parents were still trying to deny, were still trying to rationalize away. She was sensing, with the clarity that sometimes comes to young people who haven't yet learned to rationalize away their instincts, that something was very wrong. Something was coming. Something was close. Something was approaching with the inevitability of a storm moving across the sky. At night, Emma would lie in her bed and listen to Jake moving through the house below. She would hear his whining, his pacing, his desperate attempts to communicate something that transcended the normal language of dogs. She would think about what Officer Martinez had said, that Jake's instincts had kept him alive more times than could be counted, that those instincts were honed by 9 years of police work, that those instincts were more reliable than anything a human could provide. She would think about what that meant. It meant that Jake was sensing a threat, a real threat, a threat that was close enough for him to detect, close enough for his highly trained senses to pick up on, close enough that he felt compelled to warn them, night after night, in whatever way he could. She began keeping her window locked. She had always locked it before bed, but now she would check it multiple times, testing the lock, making sure it was secure, making sure that nothing could open it from the outside. She began pushing her dresser in front of her door at night, creating a physical barrier between herself and whatever might be lurking in the hallway. She began sleeping with her phone in her hand, fully charged, ready to call 911 at the first sign of danger, her thumb hovering over the emergency number like a lifeline. She began researching home invasions on her computer. She began reading stories about burglaries in suburban neighborhoods. She began learning about security systems and motion sensor lights and the ways that people protected themselves from threats. She began living in a state of low-level fear that was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Sarah noticed these things. A mother always notices when her child is afraid, even if she tries to pretend she doesn't, even if acknowledging that fear would mean accepting that something was genuinely wrong. And it broke her heart. It broke her heart that her daughter was frightened in her own home, in what was supposed to be a sanctuary, in what was supposed to be the safest place in the world. It broke her heart that her daughter had been forced to grow up, to lose her innocence, to begin understanding that the world was not as safe as she'd always believed it to be. She tried to talk to David about it, tried to express her growing conviction that something was genuinely wrong, that they needed to take Jake's warning seriously, that they needed to do something before what? Before something happened? Before the threat that Jake was sensing became a reality. But David kept rationalizing it away, kept trying to find logical explanations for what was clearly an illogical situation. "We're all getting worked up," he said one evening, his voice carrying the tone of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "We're feeding off each other's anxiety. Jake senses that we're nervous, so he gets more nervous, and it becomes this feedback loop. We need to break the cycle. We need to stay calm. We need to act like everything is normal, and eventually, everything will become normal. But staying calm was becoming impossible. Acting like everything was normal was becoming a lie that no one could quite maintain. The tension in the house was palpable, almost tangible, like a physical presence that occupied the same space as the family. By the end of the third week, the entire household was on edge, living in a state of heightened alert that was beginning to take a toll on everyone's mental and physical health. Sarah had taken to checking the locks on all the doors multiple times per day. Once in the morning, once after lunch, once in the evening, once before bed. She had researched home security systems and gotten quotes from 3 different companies, comparing prices and features, trying to determine what level of protection would be sufficient. She had started keeping her car keys on her nightstand, within easy reach, as if being able to grab them quickly would somehow provide a sense of security. She had begun sleeping in her clothes instead of pajamas, as if being fully dressed would somehow make her more prepared for whatever she feared was coming. As if being dressed would give her the ability to move quickly, to act decisively, to protect her family. Emma had stopped going out in the evenings. She had declined invitations to movies and parties, making excuses that grew increasingly thin and unconvincing. She had become withdrawn, spending most of her free time in her room, her door locked, her phone nearby, her world shrinking to the size of her bedroom. Her teachers had called home to express concern about her sudden change in behavior and her declining academic performance. "Is everything okay at home?" they asked, their voices carrying genuine concern, their professional experience telling them that something was not right. And Sarah had to lie. She had to say that everything was fine, that Emma was just going through a phase, that there was nothing to worry about, that this was just normal teenage behavior. But there was something to worry about. There was something very much to worry about. There was something that all of them could feel, something that hung over the house like a dark cloud, something that was getting closer with each passing day. Jake's behavior had reached a crescendo that seemed impossible to exceed, yet somehow continued to intensify. He was no longer eating at all. His water bowl was barely being touched, the water growing stale and warm as it sat untouched. He had lost a noticeable amount of weight, his ribs now clearly visible even from across the room, his coat becoming dull and unkempt. But his alertness, his intensity, his focus had actually increased rather than decreased. It was as if he was burning through his own reserves, sacrificing his own well-being, depleting his own physical resources in service of his mission to warn them, to protect them, to keep them safe from whatever he could sense approaching. One evening, David came home from work earlier than usual, sensing that something needed his attention, that his presence was required at home. He walked through the front door to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, a cup of cold coffee in front of her, her hands wrapped around the mug as if seeking warmth that the cold liquid could no longer provide. "I think we need to call the police," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, her words carrying the weight of a decision that had taken her days to reach. "I think we need to tell them that we're concerned about our safety. I think we need to ask them to increase patrols in our neighborhood. I think we need to do something, David. Because I can't live like this anymore. I can't watch our daughter be afraid. I can't listen to that dog warning us night after night. I can't pretend that everything is okay when I know, with absolute certainty, that everything is not okay." David sat down across from her, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion there, the fear, the desperation, the absolute conviction that something was wrong. "Sarah, we can't call the police and say our dog is acting weird. Please send someone. They'll think we're crazy," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. He was beginning to believe it too. He was beginning to sense what Jake was sensing, what Sarah was sensing, what Emma was sensing. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a matter of anxiety or paranoia or shared delusion. This was real. Something real was happening. "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, and her voice broke slightly, the strain finally becoming too much to contain. "What do we do when our daughter is terrified, when our dog is clearly trying to warn us about something, when we can all feel that something is wrong? What do we do, David? How do we protect our family from a threat we can't even identify?" He didn't have an answer, and that lack of an answer hung between them like an accusation. That night, Jake's behavior reached a new level of intensity that suggested they were approaching some kind of critical point, some moment when whatever was building would finally reach its climax. He didn't pace, he didn't whine, he didn't move from window to window in his established circuit. Instead, he positioned himself at the sliding glass door in the living room and simply stood there, completely still, his entire body rigid, his muscles tensed as if he was holding back an enormous amount of physical force. His eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. His breathing was shallow, barely perceptible, as if he was trying to make himself as small and unobtrusive as possible, while still maintaining his vigilance. His muscles were tensed so tightly that they trembled slightly. He looked like a soldier waiting for an attack that he knew was coming, that he could feel approaching, that he was preparing himself to face. Sarah watched him from the kitchen, standing in the shadows, watching this dog who had come to mean so much to her family in such a short time. And something in her chest tightened. She could feel it too now. Whatever Jake was sensing, whatever danger he was detecting, it was close. It was very close. It was almost here. It was approaching with the inevitability of dawn approaching darkness, with the certainty of a storm reaching land, with the finality of a reckoning that had been building toward this moment all along. Emma came downstairs around midnight, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, her mind too active, her fears too intense to allow her body to rest. She found her mother standing in the dark kitchen, watching the dog, watching the darkness beyond the glass door, watching and waiting for something she couldn't quite name. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice small and frightened in the darkness. "What's happening? Why is Jake so scared? Why are you so scared?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, wrapping her arms around her, holding her as if she could protect her from whatever was coming, as if maternal love could somehow shield her from danger. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said quietly. "But I think Jake is trying to tell us something very important. And I think we need to listen. I think we need to pay attention to what he's trying to communicate. Because his instincts are telling him something that ours are just beginning to understand." They stood together in the darkness, mother and daughter, watching a dog who had spent 9 years learning to recognize threats, watching him stand guard over the home and family he had come to protect. And in that moment, both of them knew with absolute certainty that Jake wasn't being paranoid. Jake wasn't suffering from adjustment issues or the quirky behavior of a retired police dog learning to relax. Jake was warning them. He was trying to tell them that something was coming. Something was close. Something was about to change their lives forever in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. David, awakened by the silence of his family's absence from bed, came downstairs to find them standing in the kitchen. He joined them without speaking, understanding without words that they were all sensing the same thing. that they were all beginning to understand what Jake had known all along. The three of them stood together in the darkness, watching the dog, watching the darkness beyond the glass, waiting for whatever was coming. And Jake was running out of time to make them understand. Whatever was approaching was close now. Very close. And the night that would change everything was only hours away. The night arrived like a predator stalking its prey. Silent, inevitable, and utterly without mercy. It came on a Thursday, the kind of ordinary Thursday that would normally pass without notice, without significance, without leaving any mark on the calendar of memory. But this Thursday would be different. This Thursday would be the night that divided the Morrison family's life into two distinct periods, before and after. The day had been unremarkable. David had gone to work, spent 8 hours in his office dealing with spreadsheets and tax codes and the mundane details of other people's financial lives. Sarah had cleaned the house, run errands, tried to maintain the facade of normalcy even as her anxiety continued to build like pressure behind a dam. Emma had gone to school, sat through her classes, tried to focus on lessons even as her mind remained elsewhere, turned inward, focused on the dread that had become her constant companion. But as the sun began to set, as the sky transformed from blue to purple to black, something shifted. The air itself seemed to change. The temperature dropped several degrees despite the forecast, calling for mild weather. The birds, which had been singing throughout the day, fell silent. Even the normal sounds of the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional barking dog, the sound of children playing, seemed to fade away, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to occur. Jake knew. He had known all along, but now his knowledge crystallized into absolute certainty. His behavior, which had been frantic and desperate throughout the previous weeks, suddenly became eerily calm. He stopped pacing. He stopped whining. He positioned himself at the sliding glass door and simply waited, his entire being focused on the darkness beyond. His muscles coiled, his senses heightened to their maximum capacity. Sarah felt it too. She called David at work around 4 p.m., something she rarely did. "Come home," she said simply, without preamble, without explanation. "What's wrong?" David asked, already sensing the urgency in her voice, already beginning to move, already gathering his things. "I don't know exactly," Sarah said. "But something is happening. Something is about to happen. I can feel it. Jake can feel it. Emma can feel it. Please, just come home." David left the office immediately, telling his secretary that there was a family emergency, not bothering to explain further. The drive home, which normally took 25 minutes, took him 18. He drove faster than was safe, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with possibilities, with fears, with the terrible certainty that something was about to occur. Emma came home from school to find her mother standing at the front window, watching the street, watching the neighborhood, watching for something. She didn't need to ask what was happening. She could feel it in the air, could sense it in the tension that filled the house like a physical presence. "Is Dad coming home?" Emma asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "He's on his way." They waited together in silence. Jake remained at his post at the sliding glass door, his body completely still, his eyes fixed on the darkness. The house seemed to hold its breath along with them, waiting for the moment when everything would change. David arrived home at 5:47 p.m., his face flushed from driving too fast, his eyes wide with concern and confusion. He found his wife and daughter standing in the living room, watching the dog, watching the darkness beyond the windows. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of fear that he couldn't quite conceal. I don't know, Sarah said. But Jake knows. Jake has been trying to tell us all along. Whatever he's been sensing, whatever he's been warning us about, it's coming tonight. I'm sure of it. David wanted to argue, wanted to offer rational explanations, wanted to dismiss his wife's fears as the product of anxiety and stress and shared paranoia. But he couldn't. He could feel it too. The wrongness in the air. The sense that something was fundamentally out of place, that the normal order of things had been disrupted, that danger was approaching with the certainty of nightfall. We should call the police, Emma said, her voice small but firm. We should tell them that we're concerned about our safety. David looked at his daughter, saw the fear in her eyes, saw the way she was trembling slightly, and he made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. I'd like to report a concern, he said when the dispatcher answered. My family and I have been experiencing some unusual activity around our home, and we're concerned about our safety. The dispatcher took down their information, their address, their names, a basic description of their concerns. She assured them that a patrol car would be sent to the neighborhood to investigate, to check on things, to make sure everything was secure. They'll be here in about 20 minutes, David said after hanging up, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They waited. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Outside, the darkness grew deeper, more complete, more absolute. The stars began to appear in the sky, but they seemed somehow distant, somehow indifferent to what was happening below on this quiet suburban street. Jake remained at his post. His breathing had become even shallower, his body even more rigid. It was as if he was channeling all of his energy, all of his focus, all of his being into this moment of waiting. The police car never arrived. At 6:15 p.m., David called 911 again. This time, the dispatcher sounded confused. I'm not showing any dispatch to your address, she said. Are you sure you called? Yes, I'm sure, David said, his voice rising slightly. I called about 20 minutes ago. I was told a patrol car would be sent. Let me check with the dispatcher, the woman said. There was a pause, then, I'm not finding any record of your call. Can you describe your concern again? David explained again, his frustration growing, his fear intensifying. The dispatcher assured him that this time, definitely, a patrol car would be sent. She took down the information again, as if the first call had never happened, as if his concerns were being heard for the first time. They should be there within 30 minutes, she said. But they wouldn't be. David didn't know that yet. But he would come to understand that the police would never arrive, that help would never come, that the Morrison family would have to face whatever was coming entirely on their own. At 6:45 p.m., as darkness had fully descended and the neighborhood had become completely black except for the distant glow of streetlights, Jake made a sound that none of them had ever heard before. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was something deeper, something more primal, something that seemed to come from the very core of his being. It was a sound of warning, of alert, of absolute certainty that the moment they had all been dreading had finally arrived. And then they heard it. A sound from the backyard. A soft sound, almost inaudible, but unmistakable to anyone who was listening carefully. The sound of something moving through the darkness. The sound of something that didn't belong. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Emma moved closer to her mother. David stood up, his entire body tensing, his mind trying to process what was happening, trying to understand what was occurring. Jake's entire body went rigid, his lips pulled back from his teeth. A low growl emanated from deep in his chest, a sound of absolute aggression, absolute readiness, absolute determination to protect his family from whatever threat was approaching. The sound in the backyard grew louder. Something was moving through the yard, moving toward the house, moving with purpose and deliberation. They could hear the soft crunch of leaves beneath something. Footsteps, they realized. Human footsteps. Someone was in their backyard. "Call 911 again," Sarah whispered urgently to David. David pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed. This time, when the dispatcher answered, he spoke more forcefully, more urgently. "There is someone in our backyard," he said. "There is an intruder on our property. I need police here immediately." "Okay, sir. Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Officers are being dispatched to your location now. Stay inside your home and do not confront the intruder." "How long?" David asked. "How long until they arrive?" "Approximately 10 to 15 minutes, the dispatcher said. 10 to 15 minutes. An eternity. An impossible amount of time when there was someone in your backyard, when danger was literally at your door, when your family's safety hung in the balance. The sound in the backyard moved closer to the house. They could hear it more clearly now. Definitely footsteps. Definitely human movement. Definitely someone who was deliberately approaching their home. Jake pressed himself against the sliding glass door, his entire body vibrating with controlled aggression, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. His focus absolute. He was ready. He had been trained for this. He had spent 9 years preparing for this exact moment. The figure appeared at the edge of the yard, visible only as a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the night sky. It was tall. It was broad-shouldered. It was unmistakably human. And it was moving toward the house with deliberate, purposeful steps. Emma screamed. Sarah pulled her daughter close, her own fear mixing with a fierce maternal instinct to protect her child. David stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening, struggling to understand how this could be occurring in his safe suburban neighborhood, in his secure home, in the place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. The figure reached the sliding glass door. It stopped. It looked through the glass at the family inside, at Jake standing guard, at the Morrisons frozen in terror. For a moment, nothing happened. Time seemed to stop. The world seemed to hold its breath. Everything balanced on the edge of a knife, suspended between one outcome and another. And then the figure reached out and tested the sliding glass door, checking to see if it was locked. It was. The figure paused, seeming to consider its options. Then it moved away from the glass door and began walking along the side of the house, moving toward the front, moving toward another entrance, moving with the methodical deliberation of someone who had done this before, who knew what they were looking for, who was not going to be deterred by a locked door. "He's going to the front door," David said, his voice hollow, his mind finally catching up to what was happening. "He's going to try the front door." They could hear the footsteps moving around the side of the house. They could hear the sound of the figure reaching the front porch. They could hear the sound of a hand testing the front door, checking to see if it was locked. It was. David had locked all the doors, had checked them multiple times, had made sure that every entry point was secure. But how long would that matter? How long would locked doors keep out someone who was determined to get inside? Jake's growl intensified. His entire body was trembling, with barely contained aggression, with the desperate need to protect, with the 9 years of police training that had prepared him for exactly this scenario. "We need to get upstairs," Sarah said, pulling Emma toward the staircase. We need to get to Emma's room and lock the door. We need to call 911 again and tell them someone is actively trying to break into our home." They moved toward the stairs, but David hesitated. He looked at Jake, looked at the dog who had been warning them all along, who had known what was coming, who had been trying to protect them from the beginning. "Come on, Jake," David said. But Jake didn't move. Jake remained at the sliding glass door, his focus absolute, his purpose clear. He wasn't going to leave his post. He wasn't going to abandon his position. He was going to stay right here and face whatever came next. David understood. Some part of him understood that Jake had made a choice, that the dog had decided his role in what was about to happen, that Jake was preparing to do what he had been trained to do: protect his family, no matter the cost. "Come on," Sarah called from the top of the stairs, her voice desperate, her fear palpable even from upstairs. "Come on, David." David turned away from Jake and ran up the stairs, his heart breaking even as he did so, understanding on some level that he was abandoning the dog who had tried so hard to protect them, who had sacrificed his own well-being to warn them, who had known all along what was coming. He reached Emma's room and helped Sarah lock the door. He pulled Emma's dresser in front of it, creating an additional barrier. He called 911 again and reported that someone was actively attempting to break into their home, that they were barricaded in an upstairs bedroom, that they needed police immediately. "Officers are en route," the dispatcher assured him. "They should be there in approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Could they survive 5 minutes? Could they hold out that long? And then they heard it, the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. The sound of the sliding glass door shattering. The sound of someone forcing their way into the house. The sound of the moment when the barrier between safety and danger had been irrevocably crossed. They heard Jake's roar, a sound of absolute fury and protective rage. The sound of a dog who had finally been given the opportunity to do what he had been trained to do, what he had been waiting to do, what he had been prepared to do all along. The sounds that followed were chaotic, violent, terrifying. The sound of a struggle, the sound of something crashing, the sound of Jake's growls and snarls mixing with the sounds of a human voice, a human struggle, a human attempt to fight back. Sarah covered Emma's ears, pulling her daughter close, trying to shield her from the horror that was unfolding downstairs. David stood at the locked door, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body shaking, his mind torn between desperate need to help Jake and the equally desperate need to protect his family. The struggle downstairs seemed to last forever, though it probably lasted only seconds or minutes. And then, suddenly, there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. The sound of sirens in the distance. Blue and red lights beginning to flash through the windows. The sound of police cars arriving, of officers jumping out, of urgent voices shouting commands. The sound of help finally arriving, but arriving too late to prevent what had just happened. Arriving too late to stop the night from changing everything. Arriving too late to preserve the perfect life that the Morrison family had believed they possessed. The night that was supposed to be just another ordinary Thursday had become the night that would haunt them forever. The night when danger had finally breached their walls, when the threat that Jake had been warning them about had finally arrived. When everything they thought they knew about safety and security in the world had been shattered as completely as the sliding glass door. The police flooded into the Morrison home like a tide, their uniforms crisp and official, their weapons drawn and ready, their voices sharp with the practiced authority of people trained to take control of chaotic situations. Officers moved through the downstairs, securing the scene, establishing a perimeter, treating the house as a crime scene rather than a home. The blue and red lights from the patrol cars outside cast everything in an alternating glow that felt surreal, dreamlike, as if the Morrisons were watching events unfold from inside a nightmare, rather than from the safety of their own bedroom. An officer came to the upstairs bedroom door and called out, identifying himself as Lieutenant Morrison. No relation, he explained, and instructing David to unlock the door. David complied, his hands still shaking, his mind still struggling to process what had occurred downstairs, what Jake had done, what the cost of that protection had been. "Are you and your family safe?" the officer asked as he entered the room, his eyes scanning the three of them, assessing for injuries, for trauma, for immediate threats. "Yes," David said, his voice hoarse. "We're safe. But there's a dog downstairs, our dog. He stopped the intruder. He protected us." The officer's expression shifted slightly. "There's a dog downstairs. Is it secure? Is it a threat?" "No," David said. He was trained as a police dog. He was protecting us. He's not a threat." The officer spoke into his radio, requesting that animal control be contacted, requesting that someone check on the dog, requesting that the scene be fully secured. Then he turned back to the Morrisons. "I'm going to need you all to come downstairs," he said gently. "We need to get statements from each of you. We need to understand what happened here tonight." Sarah pulled Emma close. "Can we have a few moments? Our daughter, she's been through a lot." The officer nodded, his expression softening. He understood, on some level, what the Morrison family had just experienced. He had been a police officer for 23 years, and he had responded to home invasions before, had seen the aftermath of violence, had witnessed the way that such events shattered the illusion of safety that people clung to. "Take a few minutes," he said. "But we do need to move downstairs soon. The paramedics are here, and they need to check you all for injuries." He left the room, closing the door behind him, giving them a few moments of privacy in the chaos that had engulfed their home. Sarah held Emma, who was trembling, whose eyes were wide with shock, who seemed to have retreated somewhere deep inside herself, somewhere safe, somewhere where the horror of what had just happened couldn't quite reach her. David sat on the edge of Emma's bed, his mind still unable to fully process the events of the past few minutes, his heart still pounding with adrenaline and fear and the terrible knowledge of what Jake had sacrificed to protect them. "Is Jake okay?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice small and fragile. "Mom, is Jake okay? What happened to Jake?" Sarah and David exchanged a look. They didn't know. They had heard the struggle, had heard Jake's growls and snarls, had heard the sounds of combat, but they didn't know the outcome. They didn't know if Jake had survived, if he had been injured, if the dog who had tried so hard to warn them had paid the ultimate price for his protection. "We'll find out," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We'll go downstairs and we'll find out." But even as he said it, he feared the worst. He feared that Jake, in his determination to protect the family, had been injured in the struggle with the intruder. He feared that the dog who had come to mean so much to them in such a short time had made the ultimate sacrifice. They made their way downstairs slowly, carefully, as if moving through a nightmare. The living room was a scene of destruction. The sliding glass door was shattered, glass scattered across the floor like glittering diamonds. Furniture was overturned. There were signs of struggle everywhere, scratches on the floor, blood on the walls, evidence of violence and combat. And in the center of it all, lying motionless on the floor, was Jake. Emma cried out, a sound of anguish that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. A sound of grief and loss and the terrible understanding that Jake had paid the price for their safety. "Don't touch him," one of the officers said, gently but firmly, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder to prevent her from rushing to the dog. "Animal control is on the way. We need to preserve the scene." But Emma could see what they all could see. Jake was breathing, but barely. There was blood matting his fur, evidence of injuries sustained during the struggle. His eyes were open, but they seemed unfocused, distant, as if he was already beginning to slip away from the world. "We need to get him to an emergency vet," Sarah said urgently, her maternal instinct extending to the dog who had become part of their family. "We need to help him. He saved our lives. We can't just stand here." The officer spoke into his radio, requesting information about emergency veterinary services, requesting that someone be contacted, requesting that Jake be transported to an animal hospital as soon as possible. "There's an emergency vet clinic about 15 minutes from here." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "I'm sending the address to your unit." "We're going with him," David said firmly. "We're going to the vet with Jake." The officer didn't argue. He understood. He had seen enough in his 23 years of police work to understand that some bonds transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal, that some acts of heroism deserved to be honored, that some debts could never be fully repaid. The paramedics checked the Morrisons for injuries, minor cuts and bruises from their panic, from their rush upstairs, but nothing serious, nothing that required immediate hospitalization. They were given the all clear, though the paramedics noted that they would likely benefit from psychological evaluation in the coming days, from counseling, from professional help in processing what they had experienced. As the police were removing the intruder, a man named Marcus Devereaux, age 34, with a history of home invasions and violent crime stretching back 15 years. David caught a glimpse of him. Devereaux's arm was badly mauled, bearing the marks of Jake's teeth and claws. His face was scratched and bleeding. His clothing was torn. He looked defeated, diminished, as if the fight had been knocked out of him by the ferocity of Jake's attack. "That dog," Devereaux said, his voice hollow, his eyes distant. "That dog is not normal. That dog is a weapon. I've never encountered anything like it. I've broken into hundreds of homes, and I've never—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone present understood what he was trying to say. Jake had been unlike any dog he had ever encountered, had fought with a skill and determination that transcended normal canine behavior, had been trained for exactly this scenario, and had executed that training with lethal precision. Officer Martinez arrived at the scene about 30 minutes after the police had secured the house. He had been called by the police department, had been informed that his retired K9 had been involved in a home invasion, had rushed over as quickly as he could. His face, when he saw Jake lying on the floor, bleeding and barely conscious, crumpled with emotion. "Jake," he said, kneeling beside the dog, his weathered hand gently touching the dog's head. "Jake, buddy, hang in there. We're going to get you help. You did good. You did real good." Jake's eyes seemed to focus slightly on his former handler, seemed to recognize him, seemed to understand that Martinez was there. His tail thumped once, weakly, against the floor. A gesture of acknowledgement, of connection, of the bond that had been forged between man and dog over 9 years of working together. "We're taking him to the emergency vet," David said. "We're going to do everything we can to help him." Martinez nodded, his eyes wet with tears. "He was always like this," he said quietly. "Always willing to put himself between danger and the people he cared about. That's what made him such a good police dog. That's what makes him such a good dog now." The emergency veterinary clinic was a modern facility with bright lights and efficient staff. People trained to handle trauma and emergency situations. They rushed Jake into surgery immediately, working quickly to assess his injuries, to stop the bleeding, to repair the damage that had been inflicted during his struggle with Devereaux. The Morrisons waited in the waiting room, along with Officer Martinez, along with a police victim advocate who had been assigned to help them process what had happened, to provide resources and support. They sat in uncomfortable chairs under fluorescent lights, drinking bad coffee, waiting for news about Jake's condition, waiting to learn if the dog who had tried so hard to protect them would survive. Hours passed. The night deepened. The waiting room remained mostly empty except for the Morrisons and Martinez and the victim advocate. At some point, Sarah fell asleep against David's shoulder, exhaustion finally overwhelming her anxiety. Emma sat with her phone in her hand, scrolling through social media, unable to focus on anything, unable to process information, existing in a state of numb shock. Finally, a veterinarian emerged from the surgery area. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had delivered both good news and bad news many times before. "Jake is stable," she said, and the relief that flooded through the room was almost physical. "He's going to make it. He has some serious injuries, deep lacerations, a broken rib, significant blood loss. But he's strong, and he's a fighter. We've repaired the worst of the damage. He's going to need several weeks of recovery, and he'll need pain management and physical therapy. But he's going to be okay." Emma burst into tears, tears of relief, tears of gratitude, tears of the emotional release that comes from surviving something terrible and discovering that the one you love most has survived as well. "Can we see him?" David asked. "In a little while," the veterinarian said. "He's in recovery right now, and we need to monitor him closely. But yes, you'll be able to see him soon." Officer Martinez stood up, his own eyes wet with tears. "He did it," he said, his voice filled with wonder and pride. "He actually did it. He protected them just like I knew he would." When they were finally allowed to see Jake, the dog was in a recovery room, hooked up to IV lines and monitoring equipment. His body shaved in places to reveal the extent of his injuries, his breathing shallow but steady. He looked small somehow, vulnerable, diminished by the medical equipment surrounding him. But when he saw the Morrisons, when he recognized them, his tail thumped weakly against the bed, and his eyes seemed to focus on them with recognition and affection. Emma knelt beside the bed, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment, and gently touched Jake's head. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for being so brave." Jake's eyes closed, and his breathing seemed to deepen, as if he was finally allowing himself to rest, finally allowing himself to relax now that his family was safe, now that his mission was complete. Over the following days, as the full story emerged, the Morrisons came to understand just how close they had come to tragedy. Marcus Devereaux had been stalking their neighborhood for weeks, studying homes, identifying targets, planning his invasions with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. He had specifically targeted the Morrison home because he had observed that David and Sarah worked during the day, that Emma was in school, that the house appeared to be empty for extended periods. He had planned to break in during the day, when no one was home, to steal valuables and leave without being detected. But then Jake had arrived. Devereaux had observed the dog, had noted his unusual behavior, had recognized that something about this particular canine was different from the typical family pet. But he had decided to proceed anyway. Convinced that he could handle any dog, convinced that his experience and his size and his determination would be enough to overcome whatever obstacles stood in his way. He had been catastrophically wrong. When Devereaux had finally attempted the break-in that Thursday night, he had chosen to do so in the evening, hoping to catch the family in a state of relative inattention, hoping to overwhelm them quickly before they could respond. But he hadn't counted on Jake's training, hadn't anticipated the ferocity of a dog who had spent 9 years learning to protect and defend, hadn't understood that he was facing not just a pet, but a weapon, not just an animal, but a soldier. The police investigation revealed that Devereaux had broken into 47 homes over the course of his criminal career. He had never been caught before. He had never been stopped. He had operated with the confidence of someone who believed himself to be invulnerable, invincible, beyond the reach of consequence. But Jake had changed that. Jake had stopped him. Jake had prevented him from completing his crime, had protected the Morrison family from violation and potential violence, had ensured that this particular predator would finally face justice. At the trial, which occurred 3 months later, the prosecutor presented the evidence of Devereaux's injuries, evidence of the severity of Jake's attack, evidence that demonstrated that without the dog's intervention, the Morrison family would have been victimized. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Devereaux of attempted burglary, assault, and breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the fact that he had finally, after 47 successful invasions, been stopped. And through it all, Jake recovered. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. The veterinarians had been right. He was strong, and he was a fighter. Within 6 weeks, he was able to walk around the house. Within 3 months, he was able to play in the backyard, though his movements were still somewhat stiff, still somewhat painful, still bearing the marks of his injuries. But something had changed in Jake during that night of the invasion. The constant vigilance, the endless pacing, the desperate warnings, all of that had ceased. It was as if Jake had finally accomplished what he had been trying to do all along, had finally communicated the danger that was approaching, had finally been able to act on his training and his instincts. He was calmer now, more relaxed, more able to simply be a dog, rather than constantly being a sentry, constantly being a warning system, constantly being on high alert. The Morrison family had changed too. They had learned, in the most visceral and terrifying way possible, that the safety they had taken for granted was fragile, that danger could arrive at any moment, that the world was not as predictable or as secure as they had believed. But they had also learned something else. They had learned about courage, about loyalty, about the way that love could manifest itself in the willingness to sacrifice, to suffer, to put oneself in harm's way for the protection of others. Emma had become quieter, more thoughtful, more aware of the complexities of the world. But she had also become closer to her family, more appreciative of their presence, more understanding of the preciousness of safety and security. She had started volunteering at the animal shelter, working with rescue dogs, wanting to give back in some small way to the animals who had given so much. Sarah had started seeing a therapist, processing the trauma of that night, working through the fear and anxiety that had emerged from the experience. But she had also become an advocate for home security, for awareness, for the kind of vigilance that Jake had been trying to teach them all along. David had become more present, more engaged with his family, less focused on work and more focused on the people he loved. He had taken a leave of absence from his accounting firm, had spent time with his family, had helped Jake through his recovery, had come to understand, in a way that he never would have before, what truly mattered in life. And Jake had become a hero. His story had been picked up by local news, then regional news, then national news. He had been featured in newspapers and magazines. He had been invited to appear at police department events and community gatherings. He had become a symbol of loyalty and courage, and the extraordinary ways that animals could protect and serve. But more importantly, to the Morrison family, Jake had become a beloved member of their household. He was no longer just a retired police dog, no longer just an animal they had taken in out of a sense of duty or obligation. He was family. He was the one who had saved them. He was the one who had known, all along, what was coming. And in the quiet moments, when the Morrisons would sit together in their living room, the sliding glass door now replaced with a new one, the house repaired and restored, they would watch Jake and remember that terrible night. And they would be grateful. Grateful for his warning. Grateful for his courage. Grateful for the fact that they had listened, that they had taken his fears seriously, that they had trusted his instincts, even when doing so seemed irrational and paranoid and impossible to explain. Grateful, most of all, that Jake had been there.